Hello, my name is Ian. Welcome to my channel, Inflightmuzik, and today I want to go over the concept between headroom versus dynamic range. So this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions in mastering, or mixing even. People will talk about things like gain staging and the difference between using hardware emulation plugins versus your normal stock plugins, and all of that does make a difference. I don't want to focus on that quite yet. I probably will in a future video. But today I want to show you guys why an engineer might send the mix back to you and they tell you that you've squashed the mix, or it's too loud, or it's over compressed, or that you've just done too much to the mix in general. So about a week ago, I recently watched a video where DJ Pain 1 proposed the question, should you be mastering your beats? He says that he doesn't master his beats, and 100% I believe him. I know that he doesn't. He actually showed his mastering chain and there was nothing on there. But one thing that does happen, I noticed that he was clipping in his master channel. Now, that's actually a way to quote unquote master your beats as well, in terms of trying to get your beats loud and competitive. A few months ago, I actually did a test where I downloaded the top 30 beats on BeatStars and ran them through a loudness meter to see what levels these beats were hitting at. And I actually did it again about a week ago. And I could tell you right now that the loudness wars that we were in back in the early 2000s, which really started in the 80s and 90s, but it reached its peak around in between 2000 and 2010. I could tell you right now that it's actually going away a little bit. The reason being is because of platforms like Spotify and other streaming services that are actually turning your beats down, turning down your music or your mastered songs down if they're too loud. And right now, the standard on Spotify is actually -14 LUFS. That will actually surprise some people in terms of how loud that actually is or isn't. Now, I think this will actually help you guys in terms of how loud your beat should be. So when I first did this test, I remembered that the loudness before I did that test, a lot of people were claiming that people were pushing their beats to as loud as -6, sometimes even -4 LUFS, which is insane. I mean, you're talking about levels that are so loud, it's hard to imagine that you weren't getting any sort of distortion, which you were. You definitely, a lot of those tracks, a lot of those songs were actually distorting. And what happens when Spotify turns your music down to, say, -14, you're listening to all these songs in a row at the same loudness level. And what that does, it exposes the beats or the tracks in general that are hyper compressed or hyper limited, and you're going to hear all the extra artifacts, all the nastiness that comes with that. So what I found when I did that test with the top 30 beats selling on BeatStars, the average LUFS that I found was actually -8. So it actually came out to be a lot lower in volume than what I previously had heard people were shooting for, or not even shooting for, but were just generally making their beats. Well, the test that I did last week was a lot better. It was actually closer to -10. Some tracks were even as low as -12. Now, what that tells me is, one, people are realizing that you can't have overly loud beats. And the main reason being, when an artist goes in and tries to record on their beat, especially when they're only buying an MP3 or a WAV, they're not going to be able to fit their vocals in. If you're a really good engineer, you'll figure out a way. In terms of having the best quality possible, really, you want to be giving an artist something somewhere between -14 and -18. That's not to say that the beats that I'm posting on BeatStars are -14 to -18. Like I said, the quietest that I was finding was around -12. DJ Pain 1's beats that I tested out were right around lower than -11. So it was, I remember one of them was actually averaging -11.7. So it was closer to -12 than anything. And the way that he's achieving that is through the hard clipping that he's doing on his master bus. So he's not adding any plugins like limiting or compression. What he's doing is he's taking the highest peaks in his waveform, and those are getting hard clipped off of the master bus. And what that allows you to do, you would think if you've watched previous tutorials from other producers or other engineers, they tell you not to do this, but it's actually very common in hip hop or even trap music, maybe even more common in trap music. Basically, you'll see that your kick drum is usually the loudest element in your beat, but it will literally chop off the very tip top of that kick drum and allow you to move all the other sounds up in volume. And that's how he's achieving that loudness that's louder than -14 or -16. What you'll notice is if you don't add any plugins on your mastering chain and you just lower the volume to where it's hitting right below 0 and you throw that in a loudness meter, typically it will be somewhere around -16, -18 with the peaks hitting 0. Typically. Sometimes you'll have more dynamic music. So, like say, for example, if you're making something like jazz or blues or something, which tends to be super, super dynamic, you're going to have really low elements and really high elements. You might see some music that's like -23 or -22, somewhere in the -20s in terms of LUFS. I should mention that you shouldn't confuse this with RMS or peak metering, because this is not the same thing. RMS is closer to LUFS than DBFS, which is your peak levels. This is why you actually need a separate metering system from your DAW. Maybe some DAWs have it, but off the top of my head, I don't think any DAW is using meters that are actually measuring LUFS. So the plugin that I'm using to measure this is Ulan Loudness Meter. And it's a free plugin, so I'm going to link this to you down below in the description. This is version 2, which is still free, and it really does the job. The main thing that you're going to be focusing on is this integrated loudness, which is basically the overall loudness of the track. And the way that I use this is I go to the loudest portion of my track, which is typically the chorus, and I just have that looping. And I'll just loop that 1 or 2 times, and that'll give me my integrated loudness. All of the other numbers, I don't necessarily really pay attention to. Again, the most important number is your integrated loudness. But that being said, I want to show you the difference between headroom and dynamic range. So when an engineer sends your mix back to you and says that it's overcompressed or you've done too much, from that DJ Pain 1 video, I saw that literally not a single person got this right. They said that, well, as long as you give them enough headroom, you're fine. And that's actually completely incorrect. The thing is, a lot of people were saying, oh yeah, just turn it down by -6, or just turn it down by -6, or -3, or -10, -16. None of those numbers matter. If that was the issue, then the engineer themselves would be able to fix it. They wouldn't be sending that beat back, because guess what? They also have a volume knob. They can turn down the volume down to -3 or -6 or negative whatever and give themselves that same headroom. That's not doing anything. That's not the issue at all. The issue is more what DJ Pain 1 was actually saying in his video. So he doesn't use compressors or limiters, and that's not what I'm telling you not to do. It's okay to use a compressor or limiter. It's when you overuse it. So right here, I have 3 different examples of limiting and compression. Really, it's just limiting. Typically, I don't add any compression on my beats. I will actually get into a future video where I will show you how I would use compression on a master if I do use it. I just recently finished a 30-day beat challenge, and every single one of those beats, except for maybe a couple, I was just using FL limiter, which people tell you not to do. That's the reason why I know I need to do a tutorial on using FL limiter. But that being said, let me go ahead and show you these 3 examples of an over-limited master, and then a limited master that I might post up on BeatStars, and then a master that has no plugins on the master chain at all. And the main thing that I want you to pay attention to is this loudness meter and where we're hitting in terms of integrated loudness. So let's go ahead and play this first one. You'll notice a difference in quality overall. Now, something that you might have noticed is there was a little bit of distortion going on right around this area right here where it was playing. And that distortion was coming from the kick. And that happens when you are really pushing the limiter. And again, this is about the levels that I was seeing when I first did this test with the top 30 beats on BeatStars. And like I said, it's gotten better. This time around, not a single beat was this loud. Not a single beat that I tested out was -8 LUFS. The loudest that I was getting was something like -9.7, so it was closer to -10. Overall, I was seeing that the majority of the beats were closer to 10 and 11 LUFS. Already, you could see the issues. Yeah, it's really loud, but you're hearing distortion here. And like I said, before that era, people were talking about -6 and -4. And that was, I really can't imagine those sounding good at all. You can also see it in the waveform. You could see that there's very little peaks and dips, and that's what an engineer is referring to as dynamic range. So you can see that this waveform basically just looks like a square. It's just a really thick sausage. You could see in this next waveform, it's almost the same, but there's a lot less limiting, but you could tell that it's less limiting because when you go into this section right here, you could see the thickness of this area is not quite as thick as this area. So this dynamic range is very, very low compared to this. This has a more increased dynamic range. So there's a bigger difference between the peaks and the dips in this waveform. So let's go ahead and play this version, and I'm just going to reset the loudness meter. From there, you could tell that that kick is no longer distorting. You're not hearing the crackling, which honestly, I'll be 100% honest with you, only happened a couple times. So that's probably why -8 was pretty popular. You could get away, if you just mixed it just right, you could probably get away with -8 and really get your beats louder than a lot of other people. But -10, -11 is about what I'm shooting for nowadays in terms of competing with what you hear on BeatStars and Airbit. The reason being, you're still getting a really loud master, but you're also not hearing nearly as many artifacts as a -8 or definitely a -6 or lower. And honestly, even this, I would say, is too loud. Some of the beats that I did on my 30-day challenge were hitting right around this area. I mean, I could tell as soon as I posted them up on Instagram, I didn't like them. I didn't like them being close to that -9 range. As soon as it starts getting to -10, I could just feel the harshness of it. So really, I'm shooting more for something in between -10, -11, but I really don't want to go too much higher than -10.2, -10.3. You could see that this was fluctuating a little bit, and there was a point in time where we hit -10 even, -10 flat, and that's probably a little too much, I would say. Again, DJ Pain 1's examples, those sounded pretty loud, really clean, and those were around -11.7. So I will say this, if you're hitting -12, -11 in that range, you're still going to sound loud and you're going to sound competitive. So if you're in that range, you can focus more on just getting a clean mix. And that's really what I want for you guys. I want you guys to have a cleaner mix, and really in your mastering stage, all you really need to worry about is just being competitive with the other guys on BeatStars. That will get your beats the attention that they need. That way they're not playing someone else's beat and then playing your beat, and all of a sudden it's just really soft and really lackluster. However, if you were to send a mix engineer this and their artist was trying to record over this, I promise you they're sending this back as well. So my solution, one of two things ends up happening. So the artist is either mixing the beat themselves, or two, they're getting a more of a at home mix engineer to mix the song, but they're probably not getting a professional in studio mix engineer mixing that song, because they will just send that back and tell them to get the track outs. And that's not to say that this is impossible to mix vocals into, but what they're not doing is telling the artist to just turn the beat down to -3 and they'll be fine. That's not the case at all. An engineer can do that on their own. They could turn that down. They could turn down this mix knob however low that they want, but that beat is still going to be squashed. It's still going to have these dynamics in it, or the lack of dynamics, I should say. So really what you're looking for in terms of what to send an engineer, what to give an artist when they're looking for a more dynamic mix. You'll see here that I have a couple buses before my master. So this wave bus is the bus that gets sent to BeatStars. This is my untagged wave file, which is why it's labeled wave. So let's go ahead and take a listen to what this sounds like. No mastering. All this is just turned up to 0. So that's another point that I want to make before I play this. People saying that, oh yeah, I just set it to -3 dB and I'm fine, or -6. None of that matters. It could be 0 dB. That's not what the engineer is talking about. I guess I already did make that point, but to re-emphasize, we're talking about dynamic range, how much you've actually compressed this, because if I were to get this file and turn it down, it's still going to be compressed. It's still going to be limited. These peaks are gone. They're gone forever. I can't bring them back. There are ways to bring them back, but it's not going to sound pretty. It's not going to sound anything like this. So let's go ahead and play this. So two things that I want to point out here. The first thing is obviously the LUFS. So we're hitting -15.7. So basically, if I were to import this into Spotify, this would not get turned down at all, because -14 is when anything above -14 is when Spotify starts lowering down your volume. So basically, this file would get played as is. And you'll notice that it probably is too quiet for Spotify. So that's why when you're sending things in for streaming, you have to balance between the two. How loud you want something to compete with everything else, how dynamic you want your music to be. So again, when it comes to BeatStars, which is basically a streaming platform, I found that -10, -11, -12, you're going to sound competitive within that range. I'd say, like I said, if you're at -12 and you're feeling like, oh, this could be a little bit louder, I wouldn't go past -11, and I would say -10 is pushing it. You're going to start hearing stuff that you don't like at certain volumes. But -12, -11, you're pretty safe. You're pretty solid. So this being close to -16, an engineer is going to love this. -16, -18, they're going to have plenty of room to work with in terms of using their own limiting, using their own compressors, using their listening environment, using their years of experience with their own ears, using their hardware equipment. If they're using hardware, they're going to have a lot more room, a lot more flexibility if they're working with this 2-track versus this 2-track versus this 2-track. And again, I can't say enough. It's not about Headroom. It has nothing to do with Headroom. And that was the second thing that I want to point out here. True peak max. You can see that we're hitting basically 0 dB. It says 0.1 dB going over. And that's something that you could solve by, if you use a program like Ozone or Ozone Elements. They actually have a true peak limiting option inside of that software. A lot of times what I was doing, like I said, there was a couple instances in the 30-day beat challenge where I wasn't using the Fruity limiter, and that was because I was using Ozone Elements instead. And I basically just use their auto mastering algorithm, which I'm going to show you guys how I do it and what settings I use and what I adjust afterwards in a future video. And basically that will catch the inner sample peaks that are going on. So even though we're not peaking above 0 with this peak meter here, I'll go ahead and play it just to prove it. You'll see that we will never go past 0. So you can see that we never go past 0 there, but the Ulan loudness meter is catching those inner sample peaks and showing that, hey, we are going past 0 with some of those other peaks. Probably there, maybe right there at the very beginning. A program like Ozone could catch that for you, but another quick solution would be to just turn this down by 0.1 or 0.2 even, which is what I would recommend. Turn it down by 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and then you'll be safe. But overall, it's not a big deal because those little inner sample peaks, those end up getting hard clipped. In a future video, I'll show you that hard clipping is not the thing that is not as scary as everyone makes it out to be. You know, people will sit there and tell you, oh, they don't know what they're doing. There's a reason, there's a reason those beats work. There's a reason those beats are getting placed. There's a reason those beats still end up sounding mixed and mastered at the very end. They end up sending the track outs anyway, and the track outs aren't clipping, which is true. The trackouts won't be clipping, but the initial file that the artist gets, they typically rap on that first, and they'll probably get sent a lot of times they get sent the trackouts later if they like the song or if they actually want to do it. If you're trying to get a loudness out of your beats without using mastering plugins, I'm just saying that is one way. And you won't get the distortion that's notorious from hard clipping. The only way that you'll get distortion from hard clipping is if it depends on what elements you're hard clipping. And again, I'll get into that in a future video. But just off the top, just a quick experiment you could do on your own. Hard clip a piano and see how that sounds. And then hard clip a kick drum and see how that sounds. Literally push that piano past the red, export it out, bring it back in, and listen to how that sounds versus hard clipping a kick drum, export that out, bring it back in, and you'll see that neither of these are hitting 0 anymore because everything that was going above 0 got clipped. It's been digitally clipped, so none of that signal is there anymore. But listen to the results of that, and you'll hear that piano sounds nasty as hell. But that kick drum sounds like, man, that sounds like something that I would put in a sample pack. And sure enough, but some kicks you'll hear that it sounds absolutely terrible. And that's because those kicks have already been hard clipped, or they've already had clipping or limiting or or have been distorted in some way. If you take something like the rack kick, which is probably the most famous kick in trap music, reason being it's not hard clipped yet. So you can hard clip that and it will sound hard as hell when you clip it. And that's one of the main reasons why that kick is so famous, because it can be hard clipped. It's not already super compressed or anything like that. It's a very flexible kick that you could go ahead and manipulate in that way. I think I covered everything that I needed to cover in terms of the difference between headroom and dynamic range. So again, I'm going to re-emphasize, when an engineer sends you your mix back and says that they can't do anything with it, that doesn't mean just turn the mix down 3 dB and say, oh, okay, well, now I have headroom. That did nothing. The engineer could have done that themselves. What we're talking about is the dynamic range in the beat. So take off your limiter, take off your compressor. I would just say, just take all of that stuff off and then send them this file with basically what I'm telling you is my Mixbus file. But yeah, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Take care. Peace.